This is the flag of Ukraine, although a lot of the time we see it in combination with another flag, this red and black flag. And so in today's video, I want to take a look at the flags of Ukraine, particularly the national flag and this red and black flag. Where do they come from, what do they mean, and by whom are they used? This is coming off the back of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which I made a video about before they actually invaded, and now it has come to it. In this video, I'll be donating half of the proceeds to charities helping the Ukrainians to either escape the conflict or those that are trapped inside the country. Now, this is the national flag of Ukraine. The colours on the flag go back to before a time when there was a separate Ukraine, back to a time when there was a kingdom or a duchy known as Ruthenia, and here it had a symbol of a golden lion on a sky blue background, apparently dating back to the time of the Kievan Rus. Although the colours of gold and blue seem to go back to pre-Christian times, when the gold represented the flames and the blue represented water. Now, we first hear of this definitively being used at the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, during which the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, who conquered a large part of what is today Ukraine, were fighting against the Teutonic Order, and several of the Ukrainians involved in the battle were said to be toting the colours of blue and gold. A little later on, the Cossacks of the wild fields of Ukraine are also mentioned as often flying yellow and blue banners from their lances as they charged on horseback, and so it became a colour that eventually became associated with this region of what is now Ukraine. So much so that it appeared on the flag of the Cossack Hetmanate from the 17th and mid-18th centuries. Now, in 1848, after a time when Ukraine had once again been divided by multiple empires, a year of rebellions in Europe, it's described that several of the Ukrainian rebels at this point were carrying gold and blue flags, particularly around Lemberg, known today to the Ukrainians as Lviv and to the Poles as Lvov, and finally to the Russians as Lvov. While the bids for independence of this Ruthenian Supreme Council were short-lived, Austrian units consisting of national Ukrainians in their army did have blue and gold banners as their insignia when they were fighting for the Austrians. Now, around half a century later in 1905, during the Russian Revolution, and of course at this point Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire, Ukrainians indeed were carrying the blue and gold flag. And what's very interesting is that in 1917, when the more famous Russian Revolution broke out, which would eventually lead to the fall of the Tsar and the start of the Soviet Union, we see that the Ukrainian flag was once again being used, but it wasn't entirely clear whether the gold was on the top or the blue, and in fact there were probably various editions of the Ukrainian flag. Another interesting point is that it wasn't only used by Ukrainians in the area that is today Ukraine, but used across the entirety of the Russian Tsardom, as it was then, by various people as a flag of rebellion, although it seems to have started in the area of Ukraine. And eventually, when Ukrainians also started to create their own states in the breakup period of the Russian Tsardom, their units often would use the Ukrainian flag of various types. And in 1918, when the Ukrainian People's Republic was founded, they did indeed choose this flag with the gold on the bottom and the blue on the top. However, in 1919, this state would be defeated by the Soviet Red Army, and instead the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic would be established, which for around a year did actually adopt a Sovietized version of that original Ukrainian flag, although as you can see, the gold and blue have switched places. Although after that, the flag was changed in line with more of the Red Army's flag, and indeed with Soviet Russia's flag itself, with the letters of USSR written on it. Following the Second World War, the flag was changed, the proportions were changed in line with other Soviet republics, for example like Belarus, which also had a similar flag design. Now, these flags of course would all be scrapped in 1991 following the breakup of the Soviet Union and the birth of Ukraine as an independent state, and for the first year they had a flag with a somewhat lighter shade of blue than the modern flag, and indeed with the similar proportions to that flag that was used for the most part of the communist period. However, this was soon changed to the flag that we now know and love for Ukraine, back to the blue and the gold. So now that we've talked about the blue and gold, what is this red and black bicolor flag that we sometimes see being used in Ukraine? Like blue and gold, red and black also have an important history in Ukraine. For example, going back to the period of the Cossacks, where alongside blue and gold, they might also have used the red and black colors on their lances when going into battle. Now, while the blue and gold of the Ukraine's flag is often described as being the endless wheat fields of gold and then the sky blue above it, red and black has a somewhat darker history, and it's described as being the blood of Ukrainians blackening the soil beneath them in their efforts for independence. And possibly because of this sort of blood and soil mentality, it has grown more popular among especially nationalists and other far-right movements in Ukraine, and indeed is strongly related with this history, as the most famous usage of this flag dates back to 1942, when it was used by the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the armed wing of a nationalist movement called the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. The Ukrainian Insurgent Army sought to create a mono-ethnic Ukrainian state, and to this end fought against both the Soviets and the Germans, as well as later the Polish underground state during the Second World War. They were, and still are to this day, seen as heroes by many Ukrainians for upholding freedom of press and indeed for fighting for a free Ukraine. However, at the same time, they openly collaborated at times with the Germans and were responsible for the ethnic cleansing of many Poles. As well as the red and black flag, the organization as a whole also carried this flag with a dagger and a cross based loosely on the Ukrainian Trident, and indeed sometimes overlaid in some way with the Ukrainian flag itself, although the red and black flag remains probably the most prominent symbol associated with the group that's used in Ukraine, and it's often seen indeed at protests and is used by some modern far-right parties like Rites sector, who have incorporated both elements of the Ukrainian dagger and the red and black on their flag. This is something that hasn't gone unnoticed, and indeed when Putin was announcing his attack on the country, he mentioned denazification, though it should be mentioned that the Rites sector only consists of 10,000 members in a country of over 40 million. However, the red and black flag can quite often be seen at protests alongside the Ukrainian flag itself, and thus remains a strong cultural symbol in certain circles in Ukraine. A few other flags to mention before rounding off are the flags of the armed forces of Ukraine. This one particularly is of the Ukrainian Army, the Ukrainian Air Force with the light blue, and the Ukrainian Navy, as we can see there, largely containing the coat of arms of Ukraine, which in Ukrainian is called the Tryzub, which in English means the Trident. And it's said that this is in fact the symbol of Volodymyr, to use the Ukrainian, or Vladimir the Great, one of the Kievan Rus princes who first converted to Christendom and who indeed lived in Kiev. And this is something that I talked about in my video about the Russia-Ukraine conflict. This is a video from over a year ago, so obviously I didn't know what would be happening at this point, but looking at the older Viking Age origins that are sometimes brought up in connection with this conflict, and if you're interested, you can check that out in the description below. So thank you very much for watching. I do hope this has been somewhat interesting and may provide some background on the flags being used in Ukraine during the present day. As I said, proceeds of this video and other videos which I'll be making in the future will be going towards helping those who are suffering the most in Ukraine at the moment. And I hope that if people can, they will also choose to donate something to the various charities that I have in the description below, because that would be really great, as the situation is very poor at the minute. Let me know in the comments below, what other kinds of videos would you like to see? Did you find this one interesting, and did you learn something new about Ukraine, its history, and the various flags that are there? In the meantime, I have been Hilbert, and this has been The History.